Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we are immersing ourselves in a family history so bizarre, so saturated with wealth, genius, and gut-wrenching tragedy that if you encountered it as fiction, you'd dismiss it instantly as historical melodrama. We're talking about the Wittgensteins.
It's one of those stories that is absolutely stranger than fiction. It really is the ultimate paradox. This was a dynasty that generated, just colossal industrial wealth, enough money to fundamentally shape the entire Austrian steel economy.
Right.
And yet at the same time, they were bankrolling the highest reaches of European high culture. Think Mahler, think Brahms, think Klimt. But internally, their whole existence was just. It was defined by this truly devastating streak of neurosis, suicide, and existential despair.
And that is the core conflict we have to unpack. Our mission today is to take a deep dive into the sources that peel back that opulence and show the hidden, tumultuous reality of this famous Viennese dynasty. We need to focus not just on the philosophical giant Ludwig or the one-armed virtuoso Paul.
As famous as they are.
Exactly. We have to look at the man who started it all, the dominating patriarch, Karl, and how volatile personalities of his children collided so violently with the two greatest catastrophes of the 20th century, the First World War and, of course, the rise of the Nazi regime.
And to really understand the Wittgensteins, their ambition, their genius, and their incredible fragility, we have to first set the stage in turn-of-the-century Vienna. Now, Vienna in this period is often, let's say, over-described. We all picture the sweeping boulevards and the elegant waltzes.
The Gilded Age fantasy.
Precisely. But the sources, like Maria Horner Lansdale's 1902 travel guide, they paint a far grubbier, much more dynamic picture that really runs counter to that standard narrative.
Oh, absolutely. Lansdale described parts of the inner Stadt, the city center itself, as, and I'm quoting, dark, dirty, and gloomy, which is not what you expect.
Not at all. And the areas where the less affluent lived were described as having interiors that were unspeakably squalid, with banisters that were rickety and sticky to the touch, and walls that quite literally oozed.
Oozed. That's a powerful image. It just gives you this picture of a city where immense privilege and intense poverty are existing side by side, sometimes behind the very same elegant facades.
And crucially, this was not a monoculture. That's another key point. The sources highlight Vienna's extreme multiculturalism. One American diplomat noted in 1898 that it was entirely possible for a German man living in Vienna to have a Polish wife, a Bohemian cook, a Dalmatian nurse,
and a Czech administrator handling his accounts.
Right. He summed it all up by declaring, no, Vienna is not a German city. And this immense diversity, Magyars, Poles, Czechs, all living together in what one source calls apparent happiness, this was the volatile, cosmopolitan social backdrop for a family like the Wittgensteins, who had this deeply complex Jewish ancestry that they were trying so desperately to shed.
And within this multicultural, slightly grimy city, what was the one true religion?
Art and culture. The middle class was absolutely fanatical. Stefan Zweig recalled that while the Viennese were tolerant of, slovenly behavior in politics or morals, they had no pardon for artistic failure.
They dressed up every single evening for the opera or the concert hall as if it were a matter of civic duty.
It was. And if a violinist hit a sharp note or a singer missed a cue, they faced absolute zero tolerance from the audience. Because, as one source put it, here the honor of the city was at stake.
So this is the intense, hypercritical crucible where a sensitive talent like Paul Wittgenstein, the future concert pianist, was expected to succeed. The standards weren't just high, they were inhuman.
Inhuman is the perfect word for it.
Okay, so the power behind this family's ability to participate in and, frankly, dominate that high culture scene was the colossal, almost unbelievable scale of Karl Wittgenstein's fortune. He wasn't just a rich guy.
Oh, not even close. He was a genuine industrial titan who, in the late 19th century, was one of the central figures shaping the entire Austrian steel and iron industry.
The scope of his empire is it's staggering. He wasn't just wealthy, he owned the infrastructure.
He did. The sources detail it pretty clearly. He was the principal shareholder of the Bohemian Mining Company, the Prague Iron Industry Company, the Teplitz Steelworks, and the massive Alpine Mining Company. And that's just the steel. Beyond that, he held influential seats on the boards of multiple major banks and even a munitions company.
And before the First World War, we're talking about an estimated fortune of 200 million kronen. To put that in perspective for you, that was enough to make him one of the wealthiest men in the entire Austro-Hungarian Empire. He was a man who could commission buildings and single-handedly prop up struggling artists without even noticing the expense.
And the way he handled his retirement in 1898, it just perfectly illustrates his ego and his need for total control. He retired at age 51, at the absolute peak of his career. But did he fully step back?
Of course not.
No. He kept his office open in the Krugerstrasse, not because he still needed to sign checks, but, in his own words, just in case the Minister of Commerce should drop in for my advice.
The arrogance is just breathtaking. He substituted industrial dominance with cultural dominance. So his retirement was filled with hunting, fencing, writing these detailed articles on economic affairs, and most famously, accumulating these magnificent collections of furniture, art, porcelain, and, critically for the family, autographed musical manuscripts.
And he was the key patron for the Secession Building, the architectural landmark of the Viennese modern movement. He was inescapable.
But what's so fascinating is that this controlling authoritarian patriarch had himself been a young, profound rebel.
Yes. The sources highlight this deeply frosty, distrustful, and really antagonistic relationship Karl had with his own father, Hermann Christian Wittgenstein, who was a land agent and a convert to Christianity.
The conflict started very early. Karl ran away from school at just 11 years old, and there's this wonderfully cinematic detail where he jettisons his expensive coat so he can pass for a street urchin.
Which, of course, failed. His plan fell apart when he was recognized begging in a coffeehouse doorway by the town mayor and was promptly returned home in deep disgrace.
But the real break came in 1865. He fled to America.
Yeah.
And what did the future captain of Austrian industry do there? He took the most menial jobs imaginable.
It's incredible. The sources describe him landing a job serving whiskeys in what the contemporary account used the shocking historical language of a nigger bar in Washington. This detail immediately establishes the total extent to which he was willing to strip away his privileged Viennese identity.
And his main duty was reportedly distinguishing between his black customers, as the owner couldn't tell them apart, so Karl could track who had paid and who hadn't. He came back a year later in 1866, completely bedraggled and speaking a garbled mixture of incorrect German and Yankee slang.
It's just a stunning piece of personal history. It shows his initial willingness to embrace complete social oblivion, only to then return and impose this absolute authoritarian structure on his own children. He demanded from them a conformity he himself had rejected.
And that antagonism continued right into this marriage. Karl resolved to marry Leopoldine Kalmus. She was Roman Catholic and half Jewish, which was a very serious offense to his father Hermann's rigid Protestant ethic and his known anti-Semitic sensibility.
The way he announced it was just. It was almost designed to provoke maximum irritation. He casually let the news slip while giving Hermann a back massage.
Terrible timing.
The worst. Karl was extolling his bride-to-be's virtues when Hermann, flat on his stomach and groaning from the massage, cut him off with this truly cutting and cynical line. Well, they are all like that at first, until they shed their skins.
Wow, just a total dismissal of his future wife as transient and interchangeable, the ultimate paternal insult.
And this detail of Hermann's anti-Semitic stance, this casual hatred that the family had to contend with generations before the Holocaust, is so critically important because it foreshadows the later tragedy. The sources confirm that the family lineage, because 3 of Karl's 4 grandparents were Jewish, would lead to the surviving siblings being classified by the Nazis decades later as Volljuden, full Jews, under the Nuremberg laws. The very identity Karl's father hated became the single thing that endangered and defined the entire family's fate.
So, if Karl's immense wealth and industrial control defined the external appearance of the House of Wittgenstein, the sources make it chillingly clear that an intense, almost paralyzing neurosis defined its inner atmosphere. This story is just stained by an unimaginable streak of suicide that haunted an entire generation.
It's a tragic repeating pattern. We're talking not just about the 2 sons, Hans and Rudy, but also an aunt and a cousin. Hermune, one of the sisters, offered a deeply telling summary of it all.
What did she say?
She cited the tragedy of their father having sons as different from him as if he had found them in an orphanage. She concluded they simply lacked the vitality and will for life that characterized Karl, the industrial engine.
They couldn't live up to him. Let's start with Hans, the eldest son. He disappeared in 1902. He was described as physically large and ungainly, stubborn and resistant to discipline, and altogether a very peculiar child.
Very peculiar is putting it mildly. His first word, according to the family records, was Oedipus.
Okay, that sets a certain tone for the psychodrama that followed.
It really does. Hans was what we might now call an idiot savant, but with a mathematical obsession. He was driven by this strange, compulsive impulse to translate the entire world into complex mathematical formulas. The specific anecdote here is just remarkable.
The Diamond Pavilion.
Yes. He became obsessed with calculating the dimensions of a massive imaginary diamond pavilion that could be constructed using the world's entire diamond yield, and he was comparing his value against the wealth of the Rothschilds.
But his sudden cessation of the project, that provides such an insight into his fragility, he just stopped.
He stopped, stating he couldn't imagine the structure being any bigger than 3 or 4 feet above the ground. His abstract genius couldn't anchor itself to reality, it just floated away.
And this kind of non-industrial genius was something Carl could not tolerate. Their relationship was described as sulfurous and tempestuous.
Absolutely. Carl was a great lover of music, but he forbade Hans from playing any instruments except during strictly designated hours. He was actively trying to force this profoundly sensitive, abstract mind into the world of business and industry, and it broke him.
Then, 2 years after Hans's disappearance, tragedy struck again, and this time very publicly. In 1904, Rudi, another intense musician, committed suicide in a Berlin restaurant bar.
And the detail of his death is almost theatrically tragic. Rudi ordered food and 2 glasses of milk, ate in agitation, and then made this famous request to the pianist. He asked him to play a popular, incredibly mournful song, Verlassen, Verlassen, Verlassen bin ich.
Which translates to, forsaken, forsaken, forsaken am I.
Forsaken am I. And then he ended his life.
What's truly insightful here is the cultural context of these deaths, specifically the connection to the public suicide of the 23-year-old philosopher Otto Weininger in 1903. This was a huge event in Vienna.
Massive. Weininger shot himself in the ultimate act of high-culture despair. He did it in Beethoven's death house, making this huge public spectacle that resonated across the entire city.
And the sources strongly suggest that Weininger's dramatic, well-publicized death, a philosopher living and dying at the poles of self-hatred and self-worship, it provided a specific context for the Wittgensteins.
It did. It allowed them to finally accept and declare Hans's earlier, quiet disappearance as a suicide. It made the unspeakable somehow speakable. And Rudi's death, just 7 months later, occurred under the undeniable silent ripple of that cultural event.
And yet, Ludwig, the future philosophical giant, he survived this atmosphere, even though he claimed to have entertained thoughts of suicide from the age of 10 or 11. He had this unusual, deeply philosophical repulsion to the act that set him apart from his brothers.
He really did. He fundamentally viewed killing oneself as always a dirty thing to do and a clear sign of cowardice. He saw suicide as a rushing of one's own defenses.
So for him, it wasn't a moral failing, it was an intellectual one.
Exactly. It was a failure of will. Ludwig, and later Paul, avoided it precisely because they viewed themselves as lacking this particular form of cowardice, the cowardice of giving up the fight. They would endure, even if enduring meant absolute misery.
This relentless neurosis was only ever mitigated by one thing: music. The sources consistently refer to music as the great solder that held the family together.
And specifically, it was the key to communicating with their mother, Leopoldine, or Mrs. Wittgenstein. The children realized that communicating their complex feelings or arguments to her through standard spoken sentences was often difficult. But she was a phenomenal musician, skilled at sight reading and transposition, even with her tiny hands.
So when she played, the family saw a transformation. Her face developed a new kind of beauty.
Yes, music bypassed their individual neuroses and became the shared, wordless language that welded each disparate member of the family, the philosophers, the musicians, the industrialists, to her and to one another.
And the setting for this shared language was truly spectacular. The music saal in the Winter Palais on the Allegas was effectively the epicenter of Viennese high culture.
You really have to visualize this room. We are told of plush hunting tapestries draped from ceiling to floor, a richly decorated pipe organ case, and not one, but 2 massive Bosendorfer imperial grand pianos facing each other, ready for duets or concerti.
And presiding over all of it, frowning down from a high black plinth, was Max Klinger's notorious statue.
The squatting, naked marble statue of Beethoven, the cultural stakes in that room were just immense.
And the guest list was simply legendary. Joseph Joachim performed there. Brahms came to listen to his own clarinet quintet. Richard Strauss, Schoenberg, and Zemlinsky were regulars.
But the atmosphere was so charged that even the greatest conductors could be completely overwhelmed. The Mahler anecdote is perfect here. Gustav Mahler, after hearing the Beethoven Archduke Trio performed in that room, famously stormed out, muttering in frustration, "Nothing more should be played now that we have heard the Beethoven Archduke Trio."
And it wasn't praise for the performance, was it?
Not at all. It was an intense, high-stakes reaction to the sheer weight of culture and genius packed into that one space. It was too much, even for Mahler.
Okay, so the transition from that high-stakes cultural scene to the early lives of the youngest boys, Paul and Ludwig die Buben, as they were collectively known, is marked by their immediate attempts to define themselves against all of that family expectation.
And they were just profoundly different, yet they shared the same basic, troubled temperament. Paul, the elder, was the natural anarchist and mischief maker, the future concert pianist. And Ludwig, or Lucky, was the future philosopher, but his earliest interests were entirely technical and practical.
He was a child prodigy of engineering. At age 10, he constructed a fully working model of a sewing machine using only wooden sticks and wire.
It's incredible. Yet he struggled profoundly in the standard academic environment. He needed intense extra tuition just to pass the entrance examination to the non-academic Realschule. Both of them were prone to neurosis, prone to fighting, and developed by adulthood into these severe, hardened individualists.
Paul launched his career just months before the war. His concert debut in December 1913 was held in the Grosser Musikvereinssaal, the famed Golden Hall, known globally for its acoustics. Paul was unknown and the program was unfamiliar, so he knew a sellout crowd was unlikely.
And he was keenly aware of the perception of using wealth to buy success, something he experienced acutely as a child. The sources mention his youthful shame at being sent by his mother to buy 200 tickets for a family friend's concert, only to be dismissed by the ticket office as a common tout.
He knew the art of papering a house, buying up tickets to ensure the hall looked full. He was so acutely sensitive to any criticism that he was just another rich dilettante.
So the debut was a technical success, but Paul remained hypersensitive to criticism. Julius Korngold, the most important critic in Vienna, walked out after the first piece. While Korngold's review, which came 3 weeks later, was admittedly slapdash, Paul seized upon it.
He didn't see it as a slight.
No, he saw it as a final and very public vindication of his talent against his family's persistent objections and expectations. Any public acknowledgement was a victory.
And at the same time, the rift between Paul and Ludwig was just intensifying. It reached a point where Ludwig detested Paul's brother-in-law, Jerome Steinbruch, so deeply that when Jerome and Gretl decided to move to London, Ludwig immediately exiled himself to a remote village in Norway to escape the possibility of their presence.
That's how extreme he was. The sources clarify that much of the tension stemmed from Ludwig's hypercritical views on Paul's music. Ludwig argued that Paul's interpretations were fundamentally spoiled by the intrusion of too much ego into music.
This is a profound philosophical difference manifesting as a family fight.
Completely. Ludwig essentially told Paul that if he wanted to hear a composer speak, I shall not turn to you. He felt Paul was constantly trying to portray himself in the composition, rather than serving the music.
And Paul's reaction.
Paul, equally sensitive, didn't argue the philosophy. He just shouted that he felt Ludwig's skepticism seeping towards me from under the door. It was an intense emotional and intellectual war fought across the continent.
While Paul was wrestling with artistic acceptance, Ludwig was catapulting himself into philosophical fame at Cambridge. Having been traumatized by the suicide of the physicist Ludwig Boltzmann in 1906, Ludwig sought out a new mentor.
And he threw himself at Bertrand Russell's feet.
Russell was initially just astonished. He described Ludwig as the most perfect example I have ever known of genius. But that genius came packaged with an intensity that was, well, almost frightening to the established academic.
Frightening is the right word. We have these legendary anecdotes of Ludwig just stalking Russell. He would appear in Russell's rooms at midnight, pacing like a caged tiger for hours, arguing philosophy. He was so desperately intense that he threatened suicide if Russell turned him away.
And Russell quickly became weary.
Oh, more than weary. While he acknowledged the brilliance, he soon described Ludwig as very argumentative and tiresome, a bore. The root of the exhaustion was Ludwig's core philosophical premise at the time, his refusal to accept that anything empirical was truly knowable.
This is where the famous rhinoceros in the room joke comes in. It's often used as a punchline, but it holds deep philosophical meaning. Russell asked Ludwig to simply concede that there was not a rhinoceros in the room.
The point wasn't about lying, you see. It was about Ludwig's rejection of absolute empirical certainty. Ludwig believed that sensory observable facts, like the absence of a rhinoceros, could never be known with the same absolute logical certainty as a mathematical equation.
So Russell's exasperation stemmed from the fact that Ludwig was armor-plated against all assaults of reasoning.
Exactly. He was ready to deny the observable world if it didn't meet his impossible standard of absolute truth.
That incredible high-tension internal drama of the Wittgenstein family was abruptly overshadowed by global catastrophe in June 1914. Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated in Sarajevo.
And yet the sources confirm Vienna's initial reaction was almost total indifference.
Why? Why indifference to the assassination of the heir to the throne?
Well, that indifference was rooted in the Archduke's intense unpopularity. He was overbearing, notoriously grumpy, and had committed the unforgivable social sin of a morganatic marriage. This meant his wife, Sophie, was not considered worthy of imperial status, a snobbish slight the Viennese public never forgave.
So the city was focused less on the assassination and more on the funeral arrangements.
Specifically on whether the Archduchess's corpse was grand enough to be interred in the imperial crypt. It was all about protocol and status, not politics.
But the chief of staff and the foreign minister saw their opportunity. The murder was used as a pretext to humiliate Serbia, and the declaration of war on July 28 set off what the sources called the extraordinary scrimmage of nations.
And the speed of escalation was just terrifying. Germany declaring war on Russia, France joining Russia, Germany invading neutral Belgium, and then Britain declaring war on Germany, all starting from a Serbian quarrel that Britain had not the slightest interest in. By August 28, the entire world was at war.
For Ludwig, this external chaos was the eruption he'd been waiting for his whole life.
Yeah.
Initially barred from leaving Austria, he volunteered for civilian duties, desperate for challenge, and a personal liberation from his own suffocating neuroses.
He wrote that his life had been one nasty mess, and he desperately hoped that things will come to an eruption. He craved it.
He craved dangerous action. Despite having old hernias that rendered him unsuitable for active service, he pushed and pushed to enlist as a private, later becoming a military official. His motivation wasn't patriotism, but a deep personal yearning.
He wrote, "I am not afraid of being shot, but of not fulfilling my duty properly." He sought danger as a form of self-purification.
And his time at the front, especially his reading of Tolstoy's Gospel in Brief, triggered a profound spiritual conversion. He attempted a radical renunciation of physical gratification, seeking eternal life in the present moment through self-denial and duty.
The transformation was so complete, so intense, that an officer serving with him observed that Ludwig had taken on all the characteristics of a prophet. He found his spiritual purpose in the chaos of the trenches, an ironic counterpoint to the logical certainty he had been seeking at Cambridge.
While Ludwig was seeking spiritual liberation, his brother Paul, a reserve officer, was thrust onto the chaotic Galician front, a deployment made disastrous by the General Staff's utter indecision.
His train trip from Vienna to the Sand took 40 grueling hours on breakdown-prone trains. It was a mess from the start.
But despite the chaos, Paul performed with remarkable valor. He received medals for outstanding personal service, including rescuing 2 men under heavy fire. But in that typical Wittgenstein style, he later dismissed these allegedly heroic deeds to his mother.
Yes, saying, "You won't believe it, but I know it." It was as if he could not accept external validation for acts he saw as mere necessity. He had to be his own judge.
And then came the life-altering tragedy in the field hospital. After being wounded, Paul lost consciousness and woke up to the devastating mutilation of his right arm having been amputated.
The injury itself was compounded by the doctors' haste. In their panic over nearby Russian troop movements, the doctors failed to cut skin flaps large enough to adequately cover the bone. This resulted in the scar being stretched too tight and adhered to the bone, adding permanent, lifelong discomfort to the shock of losing his career.
The loss of his playing arm should have ended his life as a virtuoso. But Paul, displaying that legendary Wittgenstein fortitude, decided instantly to continue.
Instantly. He was captured and shunted through Russian captivity in these vermin-ridden Chaploshki boxcars, eventually landing in Omsk, Siberia. And his resolve was fueled by his father's sheer stoicism, the encouragement of his blind mentor, labor, and crucially, Count Giza Zichy.
Zichy was a celebrated one-armed pianist and, fascinatingly, a self-help author who wrote manuals specifically for amputees.
Yes, Paul drew inspiration from Zichy's example, which included practical lessons on how to put your pants on by yourself. It was both practical and inspirational.
Paul was relentless. He practiced daily on a shabby, untuned upright piano in captivity, immediately starting to arrange pieces for the left hand. It was a complete and immediate pivot, transforming catastrophe into a new form of dedication.
Meanwhile, the third brother, Kurt or Conrad, was caught in a different kind of trap. Stuck in America due to neutrality laws, He was running a clandestine and illegal racket in false foreign passports.
And this absence deeply embarrassed his sisters back in Vienna, who felt the dishonor of his non-participation keenly, fearing he would be permanently marked down.
Kurt finally returned, only to commit suicide near the Italian front in October 1918, just as the war was ending. The context provided by the sources suggests he refused a suicidal order to expose his battalion to annihilation.
He reportedly shouted, "I am not offering my men in vain. The war is already lost."
So he shot himself, narrowly avoiding court-martial or capture by the Italians. This led to the final, painful paradox for the family. While they grieved, they found faint reassurance that, unlike the quiet, ignominious, wretched fates of Hans and Rudy, Kurt's suicide could at least be counted as an honorable death.
His death achieved a dignity that his life had lacked.
In their eyes, yes.
So November 1918 ushers in not peace, but the new disorder. The mighty Habsburg monarchy collapses, and Austria is transformed into this small, weak, and extremely unstable republic.
And the economic consequences were immediate and catastrophic. The newly formed successor states imposed food and coal embargoes. Vienna faced outright starvation, with 96% of children officially classed as undernourished within a single year.
And the hyperinflation was just ruinous. The krone became practically worthless. The sources provide this incredibly sharp detail. Rents were legally barred from rising, meaning that by 1922, a whole year's rent payment could only buy the landlord one single dinner at an averagely priced restaurant.
The family's old wealth, held in Austrian assets, just evaporated.
And it is in this context of utter economic and social collapse that Ludwig, back from the war, made his radical and famous decision. He gave away his entire enormous inheritance. He believed money was corrupting, and he wanted absolute freedom from it.
He gave it to his three rich siblings, Hermine, Paul, and Helene. But here's where the philosophical purity gets a bit murky. He specifically excluded Gretl.
Why?
Because her American investments, which were managed by her husband Jerome Stoneborough, were safe from the Austrian hyperinflation.
That raises a fascinating question, doesn't it? If he truly believed money was corrupting and had to be renounced for spiritual reasons, why exclude the one sibling whose assets were actually stable?
Exactly. Was this less about radical spiritual renunciation and more about incredibly sophisticated wealth redistribution? A way of ensuring the money stayed in the family, or at least with the members who needed protection from the post-war economy.
It's a compelling piece of analysis. But his immediate post-war ambition was equally astonishing. He wanted to become a humble elementary school teacher,
which Paul immediately saw as ridiculous. He wrote letters of reproach, pointing out the utter absurdity of this attempt at self-effacement.
His argument was essentially, you cannot hide who you are.
That's it. He wrote, "It is out of the question, really completely out of the question, that anybody bearing our name and whose elegant and gentle upbringing can be seen 1,000 paces off would not be identified." Ludwig was simply too refined, too brilliant, and too marked by his family history to disappear into obscurity.
And Ludwig's internal state during this teaching period was bleak, despite his attempts at purification. He was tormented by violent memories of war and grieving his closest friend, David Pinsent, who died tragically in 1918.
He wrote, "He took half my life with him. The devil will take the other half."
And this spiritual prophet who sought purity continually confessed to his friends that he had sunk to the lowest point. He didn't just dislike the local people he taught, he called them inhuman beings and repulsive grubs.
His attempts to achieve spiritual humility often just resulted in profound elitist cruelty.
He eventually abandoned teaching and philosophy temporarily for architecture between 1926 and 1928, designing Gretl's severe, unadorned house on the Königmann. He even proudly signed himself Ludwig Wittgenstein, architect.
And he brought the exact same neurotic, absolute demand for certainty from philosophy to the construction site. He was the most exacting client imaginable. The sources detail how he demanded millimeter-level precision. He haggled over every single door lock, every radiator fitting.
The famous incident involved the ceiling. After it had just been plastered, he insisted it be undone and raised by a few centimeters.
Yes. One of the contractors complained of coming home depressed with a headache after days of the worst quarrels, disputes, vexations. He treated the house as a philosophical problem requiring absolute cold logic, not a functional home for his sister.
Meanwhile, Paul's musical career, forged in those Russian boxcars, was ascending due to sheer willpower. He practiced up to 9 hours a day and was forced into a radical revision of his entire technique. He realized that existing arrangements for the left hand were wholly inadequate.
And this realization led to his shrewd, incredibly expensive, and utterly crucial strategy of commissioning the great composers of the era. He paid astonishing sums for new works, but he secured exclusive performing rights.
Take Richard Strauss. Paul paid a sensational advance of $25,000 for the Paragon zur Sinfonia Domestica. But even with that money on the table, the relationship was fraught.
Instantly, Paul immediately complained that the orchestration was too heavy and drowned out the piano.
Strauss, understandably annoyed, reluctantly allowed Paul to thin the texture. But Paul, never subtle, later boasted that the work had to be changed to fond en comble.
From top to bottom.
To make a decent concerto of it.
Yeah.
He was paying for genius, but demanded the right to edit it.
The most famous clash, and the most dramatic, involved Maurice Ravel, who composed the iconic concerto for the left hand. Ravel was notoriously meticulous, and Paul insisted on altering a 2-page section of the score. Ravel absolutely refused the alteration.
Paul was so furious at Ravel's resistance that he later joked, though, with a very sharp edge, about building a Fangstuhl,
A medieval chair trap.
to literally force Ravel to concede the alterations. This just shows the depth of Paul's belief in his own interpretation and his desire for total control over the music he performed.
However, Paul eventually capitulated. He admitted Ravel was right and conceded the piece was a great work, despite his general aversion to modern dissonant music. He even expressed fascination with the most complex dissonant 68 part of the piece.
So the sources reveal Paul's stubbornness, but also his eventual grudging respect for true artistic integrity that challenged his own ego.
Absolutely. His final major commission detailed in the sources was with Sergei Prokofiev. Paul, perhaps having learned from the Ravel debacle, put Prokofiev at his ease, telling him to compose whatever he wished.
Yet when Prokofiev delivered, Paul criticized the resulting concerto as not brilliant enough.
And Prokofiev, in a classic display of artistic retaliation, dismissed Paul's talent completely, suggesting Paul's loss of the right hand was actually a stroke of good luck, because with 2 hands he would have been lost in a crowd of mediocre pianists.
That's brutal.
It is. But Paul, despite the difficulty and the criticism, later praised Prokofiev for providing him with a work that was clearer than other commissioned pieces. This pattern just defines Paul. Immense ego matched by immense, uncompromising standards.
So if the Great War brought personal tragedy, the Anschluss and the rise of the Nazi regime brought something far worse: existential annihilation. Paul, in the lead-up to the German annexation of Austria, had been politically active, funding the anti-Marxist, anti-Anschluss Heimwehr.
It's important to understand the Heimwehr was a right-wing, often fascist-leaning paramilitary organization, essentially advocating for an authoritarian state in Austria. Paul's support for them was part of his anti-communist stance, but it certainly didn't protect him from the Nazis.
In fact, that political involvement may have made him an immediate target. He was arrested and interrogated on March 11, 1938.
And the political environment shifted violently overnight. The sources tell us that Paul, absolutely white with horror, came to his sister Hermann and uttered the chilling, life-defining words.
Wir gelten als Juden.
We count as Jews. We count as Jews. Their history of converting to Christianity, their wealth, their social standing, none of it mattered anymore. The Nuremberg laws focused strictly on biological ancestry. Because 3 of their 4 grandparents were Jewish, they were unequivocally classified as Volljuden, full Jews.
Paul was instantly barred from performing or teaching anywhere in the Reich.
And the immediate irony was both perverse and terrifying. Paul initially was ordered to fly the swastika flag from his palais, a required symbol of loyalty. But then, under a different law, the Reichsflaggengesetz, he was ordered to take it down by the same authorities because Jews were forbidden from displaying the symbol. His entire identity, his loyalty, and his property were instantly meaningless.
But the truly immediate, life-threatening crisis for Paul wasn't the loss of his career or the confiscation of his property. It was the law regarding racial defilement, Rassenschande. The Nazis discovered his relationship with Hilde Sania.
And Hilda was the daughter of a socialist tram inspector, and therefore deemed not of the right class by the family, let alone the Nazis. Crucially, she was pregnant with their second daughter, Johanna, who was born after the July 31st, 1936 deadline set by the Nuremberg laws.
That birth date was critical.
Absolutely critical. Because Johanna was born after that deadline to a father deemed Volljud and a mother deemed Aryan, she was automatically classified as a full Jew. Paul was immediately served with a court summons for Rassenschande. a crime which punished sexual relations between Aryans and Jews and carried a severe sentence, an average of 4 to 5 years of imprisonment or hard labor.
Paul's reaction was decisive. For the first time in his life, he packed his own bags, doing it secretly so his servants wouldn't know, took a cab to the station, and fled directly to Switzerland. Once safe, he immediately organized visas and passage for Hilda, the children, and their maid, Fräulein Rolli.
With Paul safe, the battle shifted to the fortune itself. Paul's massive foreign assets were tied up in the Wittgenstein Fund, a Swiss trust. The Nazi Reichsbank demanded the money be released to them. This led to a stunning and profoundly cynical family confrontation.
And this confrontation was largely orchestrated by Gretl. She flew to New York to lead the complex negotiations with the Reichsbank's legal representative, a man the sources describe as the Hollywood Nazi archetype lawyer, Dr. Schoen, short, blonde, and blue-eyed.
Gretl herself had recently been arrested for passport fraud in Vienna, which resulted in the confiscation of her priceless Brahms and Bruckner manuscripts. So she was fighting, quite literally, for her own assets and the properties in Vienna held by her sisters Hermine and Helene.
And in a moment of pure, calculated moral complexity, she aggressively condemned Paul in front of the Nazi lawyers. Her goal was likely twofold: to demonstrate her separation from her fugitive brother and to secure a better deal for the family members who were still trapped in Vienna.
She burst out with this stunning line: "Every damned thing my brother owns he owes to his family. He has no right to defend his fortune, since it is only through me that he is here." The sources note that Dr. Schoen couldn't suppress a satisfied grin at this moment of brutal sibling betrayal.
The outcome was a painful compromise. Paul was reluctantly persuaded to concede 1.2 million Swiss francs to the Reichsbank, which allowed him to save 2.3 million SF of his foreign assets.
But crucially, he transferred all of his valuable Viennese properties, including half of the Palais, to his sisters Hermine and Helene, who remained in Vienna and were protected by his sacrifice. Paul's money bought his sister's safety.
During this period of crisis, Ludwig was back in England, having recently returned to Cambridge. He was dealing with his own failing health and intellectual frustration.
Some students even wrongly suspected him of being a Stalinist because he said, "Tyranny doesn't make me feel indignant." He was just psychologically incapable of engaging with global political drama in the way his family so desperately needed him to.
Marga Danecki, a friend, tried repeatedly to force a meeting and reconciliation between the two brothers,
which Ludwig rejected as stupid and filled him with disgust. He saw Danecki as trying to force a connection based on sentimental memories he wanted to suppress. The philosophical avoidance of feeling extended even to his brother's imminent danger.
That distance was maintained almost until the very end. Ludwig eventually accepted an invitation in April 1950 to visit a dying Hermine in Vienna, and was reportedly devastated by her death. He himself died of cancer the following year in 1951 in Cambridge, working until his last days on his final manuscript, Uncertainty.
Paul, meanwhile, successfully rebuilt his life. He married Hilde in Havana, Cuba in 1940, choosing a private Catholic ceremony despite his earlier antipathy toward the church. They eventually gained U.S. citizenship.
Even in America, Paul remained characteristically impractical, trying to use his front door key for the lift, having his clothes stolen because he put them outside his hotel door, and being utterly helpless in tasks like buying new shoes.
But he was fiercely generous to his students. He never charged them tuition, and he would buy them clothes with the proud comment, "I don't give rubbish." His contradiction persisted to the very end.
He continued his career, arranging and composing new pieces for the left hand. He maintained that every performance was a test of his endurance and his nerve. He died in 1961 from pneumonia, having successfully survived the internal battles and the external storms of the 20th century.
You know, the saga of the House of Wittgenstein is truly a unique study in extremes. What stands out most is the profound, almost absurd irony of this colossal wealth and genius being tied to such deep emotional poverty and self-destruction.
And the deep internal contradictions they embodied. The music that served as the family's healing solder versus the underlying neurosis that repeatedly shattered their lives were just undeniable. Their struggle was one of finding meaning outside of the patriarch's industrial obsession.
And the historical catastrophes were not merely external events, they were catalysts that forced agonizing moral and personal decisions. WWI provided Ludwig with the spiritual reckoning he desperately needed, and Paul with the impetus to fully reinvent himself.
And the rise of Nazism forced the survivors into these painful, divergent paths, defined entirely by their classification as Volksjuden.
And we constantly return to the complexity of the characters. Paul, who was often abrasive, arrogant, and controlling toward composers, showed immense generosity to his students and stood up to both Ravel and Hitler.
While Ludwig, the acclaimed intellectual saint, constantly struggled with self-loathing and cruelty, calling the people around him repulsive grubs.
And then there is Gretl, the humanitarian who secured milk for starving Vienna and tried to save family friends from the Nazis, but was also this formidable Machiavellian fighter who aggressively condemned Paul in front of the Reichsbank lawyers to protect the Viennese properties and secure her own standing. Their lives are just. They are studies in morally complex survival.
The final contrast is so striking in the resting places. Karl, Leopoldine, and Rudy lie in the grand, hierarchical Zentralfriedhof plot near the cultural gods Beethoven and Brahms that they patronized.
Kurt is somewhere along the Piave River. Ludwig's remains are in Cambridge. Gretl is buried next to her tormented husband, Jerome.
And Paul, having successfully put his past behind him and forged a new identity, died and was laid to rest in America.
The source material offers a final observation on the relationship between Paul and Ludwig. It describes Paul's eventual, permanent estrangement from his brother as necessary for Paul to lead a free, fulfilled, and happy existence.
Which suggests a final, provocative thought for you to carry forward. In a life defined by extraordinary talent, immense family drama, and the historical weight of a fallen empire, can true personal freedom and emotional fulfillment only be achieved through a total, necessary act of self-estrangement from your own lineage,